And the same thing happens again in 2024 during the general election, where Labour suddenly, from Keir Starmer pretending to be a socialist inheritor of the Corbynite tradition, who's like an eco-socialist in 2020, he presents himself as like basically indistinguishable on key aspects of policy from Rishi Sunak, from like the Tory party, right? And the point is that general election is also effectively an extremely dishonest campaign, where they're not telling people ahead of time how they're actually going to govern, because they know if they tell people how they're actually going to govern, people won't vote for them.
I found out about your book and your work quite recently, and I'd followed the Twitter files quite a lot as well.
Yeah, okay.
So it was just, oh my God, there's like a second chapter to this. There's more to know.
Actually come together.
Yeah, which is incredible.
Yeah.
So we'll start. We are recording.
Yeah, okay. Cool.
Thank you for joining me.
Yeah, thanks.
Can you tell people a little bit about your work and how this sort of came about in the first place?
So originally I'm from South Africa. I'm an anti-corruption investigative journalist. I've been working for about 17 years as investigative journalist, sort of focusing on grand corruption, what we call state capture in South Africa. Which is really a very fancy way of saying when lots of very bad actors come together to effectively take over the state's capacity to build policy and make policy for corrupt gains. So people come in and make sure they run all the sort of the key institutions of government so that the government is issuing contracts that they then bid forward, win, or gatekeep over and solicit bribes for.
Right. And that was all with the Gupta family?
That's right. So it's the Gupta family in South Africa. Right. So I've been investigating South Africa since I was 25.
Yeah.
My first investigation was a thing called the arms deal, which was this deal signed in 1999, massively corrupt deal. Like hundreds of millions of dollars in bribes were paid on that deal. I think $260 million recalculated. And had this terrible impact on South African democracy because that was right after the end of apartheid. It was 5 years after apartheid ended. And there was such widespread criminality that, effectively the executive came in and shut down all investigations into the criminality there and sort of destroyed these new institutions that were being created.
Right.
That had been created after the struggle to make a functioning democracy. And that then created the context in which Jacob Zuma becomes president, and he's one of the people I'd investigated. And he works very closely with his family called the Guptas, who are just like an IT family from India.
Yeah, it sort of feels like the oligarchs of South Africa in a way.
Yeah, I mean, they were quite an odd bunch because they came in, they weren't super wealthy or successful, but they were incredibly clever and canny at building political influence with the money they had. And they used that political influence. They made themselves ridiculously wealthy.
And what was their background before? What did they make their money in?
I mean, literally, they just had an IT company.
Right, okay.
They had it's an IT trading company, a thing called Sahara. It's selling computer parts and stuff like that in South Africa. So they're quite small, right? And one of the things we were tracing when we were going through all this material was how they start with quite small-time politicians, provincial politicians, and then through that they sort of moved up the ranks until eventually they're basically working alongside the president's son.
Right.
And over the course of 8 to 9 years, they effectively become the most powerful family in the country, working hand in glove with the Zuma administration to steal just vast quantities of money, just huge amounts of money.
Right.
And I started investigating that aspect of South African corruption. It's 2017, 2018. And my specialization is to do long form investigations based on big data sets, going, really spending years and years and years investigating a scandal or a political movement or a political project.
Sure.
And, a lot of my work is cross-pollinated with the UK because quite often, the arms deal, for example, one of the biggest companies that got deals in that arms deal was BAE Systems. And it was Tony Blair who, when he shut down the Serious Fraud Office investigation into Saudi Arabia, also the effect of that was to effectively kill the South African leg of that investigation as well. So I understand the interplay between, there's never just a South African investigation.
Yeah.
You're actually looking at, multinational forms of grand corruption.
So how did you get into this in the first place? Because we were talking before and you were saying you were a DJ. So how does a DJ become an investigative journalist?
I mean, I was going to be a historian. That was what I wanted to become. That's what I wanted to be.
In what specifically?
In South Africa. I mean, I wanted to be the nerdiest, most boring historian there was. Literally, when I started doing this work, I was writing my master's thesis on a small mining town in South Africa, which I was fascinated by. And that's what I thought my path was going to be. I was going to my background is I studied history in South Africa because I have quite a unique family background, and it made me like very committed to like the new South Africa and to like the new democratic South Africa. And I wanted to dedicate my life, in a sense, maybe even subconsciously, didn't even realize at the time, but like I wanted to dedicate my life to like defending this constitutional order that had been built out of this like horror of apartheid. And I thought, well, I'm not like a lawyer. I'm not like a warrior. I'm like, what can I do? I'm very good at reading and writing. So my idea was that I'll study history, and I'll learn the history of South Africa as like an ontological exercise, as like I'll learn the history of South Africa so we can identify what went wrong in South African history so it doesn't happen again, basically. Right. So that was my idea. And at the time, I was on my academic track. I was very happy with it. And my first job out of university, working in this field, was working for this absolutely incredible journalist, guy called Mark Visser, who was writing like the definitive biography of our president at the time, a guy called Thabo Mbeki, who I have not very much good to say about Thabo Mbeki, not Mark Visser. Mark Visser is lovely. And in that investigation, Thabo Mbeki was the president when this arms deal happened, right? And he was extremely aggressive in like acting to shut down lines of inquiry in that arms deal. And that's how I met my very good colleague, Andrew Feinstein, who I worked with for a very long time, because he was an ANC MP. He was in Parliament. He was basically sent to Parliament by Mandela, right? He'd been in the struggle, he'd been fighting for liberation, came back to South Africa from exile. He was living in San Francisco, actually, and came back to South Africa, was sent to Parliament. And his role in Parliament was to investigate wrongdoing and like financial malfeasance. And he uncovered, like him and his colleagues on this parliamentary committee started investigating this arms deal. And as a result, he was basically kicked out of Parliament because he was like, I refuse to shut this down. We will follow this to wherever it goes. And he was forced out of Parliament and eventually forced out of South Africa. And I met him around about that time, and I got obsessed with this deal because it wasn't very well understood. It was like quite complicated. It was quite technical. It like happened for me, this thing was signed when I was like 15, right? So I didn't know the detail of it. So I started researching it for this book. And as I started piecing together what had actually happened and like reading all the material and reading the reports, like reading all the newspaper coverage, it's hard to think about at the time, but actually, that was before the time of like everything being online. So like you could have a newspaper story about an event that was all on paper, and like 5 years later, people wouldn't know the detail of it. So I was like literally gathering this material and then like retelling it.
Is it the thing in South Africa where the news is sort of, what is it called, taken over, I guess, captured? So the news you were reading, was that accurate or was it biased?
Well, that's actually that at the time, I still think the South African media is one of the best media environments in the country. Even though, it struggles with all the things that we struggle with around the world with the media, as in like it struggles with funding. There have been attempts to capture stuff, but actually the South African media environment is very, has a very explicit sense of itself, that its job is to stay separate from political power and to hold it to account. Right. And honestly, some of the best investigative journalists in the world are based in South Africa. So there's a group called Amabongani I work with, who are just like the best journalists you'll ever come across, just been investigating serious ground corruption for a long time, making like material differences. So stuff I was reading was accurate, but it was also like, unless you were around at the time and reading and piecing it together, you couldn't tell the whole story. So I basically put all the stuff together in one place, and I was like, once you realize the scale of this thing, you're like, this is a real threat to South African democracy. Because this corruption is the sort of thing that implicates so many different people, but it's also leading to all these attacks on institutions. We have to do something about it. So I wrote a book about it at the time. And my thinking was, I'll write this book, which is like a guide to this deal for like activists and like academics and journalists and ordinary citizens. And then I'll go back to my academic work. Right. That was my idea. I'll go back to my academic work. And then as soon as that book was finished, as soon as it came out, and it did quite well in the bookstores, I was just approached by like so many different sources who were like, you have no idea actually the scale of the corruption here. And loads of whistleblowers came forward. And I sort of had to learn how to be an investigative journalist. And it was quite interesting because I was very lucky because there's loads of like really experienced investigative journalist hands in South Africa who were like willing to show me the ropes and how to do stuff. But I also came with like a historian sense of like, you read everything, you go to the archives, you get all the material.
So what was the book initially based on? Was it based just on the news stories? Or, I know you talked a little bit about the ledgers that you found that exposed the corruption, and you wouldn't have otherwise been able to see the sort of money transfers and all of that. So the first book after?
So the first book was based on just like my idea was like, I'm just only use public sources, and only with public sources I'm going to prove there's corruption in this deal, right? And the second book I did after that was like whistleblowers coming forward, giving me documents, leaks out of like law enforcement and whatever.
Right.
And that was a much more detailed thing. But at that point, it became not super comfortable to be in South Africa, basically, because, you know, my investigations were looking into the most powerful people in the country.
Sure.
And I came here and I started working with my colleague, Andrew Feinstein. And for a long period of time, it was like, for about 2 years, me and Andrew couldn't go back to South Africa. There were these, you know, effectively warrants of arrest out for us,
right?
Because what we were investigating. And then luckily things changed politically in sort of 2018. Zuma's deposed in the midst of this big corruption scandal. But in that intervening 9-10 years, this project had like gutted the state's ability to fight corruption.
Is that connected to, because I've seen quite a few videos now that South Africa's kind of falling apart economically? Is it because of the corruption or is it because of other things?
And that's a very complicated question. That's like the biggest question.
Sure.
Right.
Okay.
I mean, corruption is like a major factor.
Right.
Like, so one of the things that corruption has done is that South Africa has all these state-owned institutions. Like, you have a big state-owned rail industry. The entire power generation industry is state-owned through something called Eskom, and all the water industries is publicly owned, all of which I'd support in the UK, right? I think it's all great. Public ownership is good. The problem is that when you have that in conjunction with like serious corruption, those services have gotten degraded. So like basically you've had real issues of power generation for like 10, 15 years, right? Where you'll still have something called load shedding, where like you'll just have like a whole area just goes without power for like 6 or 7 hours, and it's degraded all sorts of other infrastructure. So like it wasn't really understood back in 1999 or 2000 or 2001 that like one of the biggest threats to like South Africa's new democracy would be corruption, and actually has turned out to be that. And now I think that's pretty widely understood in South Africa. Like this is a serious problem that South Africa's had to face. It's like, you know, effectively under Zuma's administration, you had like a lost decade because of corruption, right? Like nothing happened. You know, nothing good happened for a decade. Lots of other great stuff outside of government happened.
Yeah, of course.
Like South Africa's an incredible place. End of apartheid. Like it's incredible to see going back how different South Africa is to when I grew up. You know, there's like amazing things that have happened there. But at like that level, it was a disaster. And then basically when Zuma is deposed, saying this political space opens up, where suddenly we can do this work in corruption again in South Africa. And that's when I start doing this Gupta state capture stuff.
Right.
Processing like huge volumes of data. There's a massive leak there's basically one of the Gupta's key lieutenants, his laptop hard drive is leaked somehow, and it has like hundreds of millions of emails, just like detailing like the inner workings of this like massive criminal conspiracy.
Right.
So basically me and other journalists and investigators, we were like pulling these threads and just identifying where all the money went. And eventually I ended up giving evidence at a Judicial Commission of Inquiry. I'm still working on this stuff. Like I still work quite a lot in South Africa on trying to find the money, where it was stolen, trying to hold people to account. It's a long-term thing.
Yeah. I see a lot of excuses and scapegoating now online, and people go, oh, apartheid ended, ANC comes in, and now essentially you get right-wingers saying, oh, okay, well now the black people run everything and now the country falls to shit. And I think it's a lot more complicated than that.
There's very much more complicated than that. That's very much not what happened in South Africa. Not least because I think what people tend to ignore is like the extent to which corruption in South Africa isn't like organic to South Africa. Like so much of this corruption that's happening is basically foreign companies, foreign multinationals coming in and identifying corrupt officials to corrupt from the beginning, right? So a very good example is that arms deal, right? Who's the beneficiary of that arms deal that like I think really sets South Africa on like a dangerous path? The beneficiaries aren't, you know, there's a handful of ANC politicians who got, you know, significant money. But the real beneficiaries they're all European arms companies. It's BAE Systems, it's Thomson Thalers, it's, you know, it's ThyssenKrupp in Germany. And like it's very explicit. If you go and have a look at the record, it's like a year after apartheid ended, you had these arms companies going to South Africa specifically trying to find the sort of individuals who would be quickly on the make, right? And in doing so, like really undermining like the fabric of the country. And the same thing with the Guptas. And it's a real problem, because the one thing I'll say about South Africa recently is that South Africa has taken this stuff seriously, right? South Africa is prosecuting people for corruption. It is getting the money back, right? And big part of my work has been going to other jurisdictions like Germany, Switzerland, the UK, and saying, you have British companies, you have Swiss companies, you have German companies who are involved in this corruption. Why aren't you prosecuting them? And none of them have been prosecuted, right? So South Africa is actually taking it quite seriously and doing good work. The only country that's been like vaguely effective at stuff has been the DOJ, who's been the United States.
Sure.
Sadly, that's all fallen apart now because of Trump, and he's basically said,
I was just there, and the flights and TSA, and people are working without money, and
yeah,
it's horrible.
mad.
Yeah.
And I mean, all the people I was working with the DOJ have effectively been told they were working in this thing called the Foreign Corrupt Practices Unit, right? And their job is to investigate American companies that bribe abroad.
Okay.
And basically, Trump came in and said, we're no longer going to prosecute that as a crime.
Right. Okay.
Which is mad. Basically, he said it's still on the statute books, but he basically said we're not going to prosecute corruption as a crime, which means these people don't have jobs, basically.
Right.
So, anyway, so how I got into this stuff onto the Labour Party.
Yeah. So what you moved here, and then you started doing journalism in the UK.
Yeah, that's right. So, and we ran this little organisation which was called Corruption Watch UK for a while.
Okay.
Now it's called Shadow World Investigations, long form investigations into like all sorts of different types of corruption, Russian oligarchs for a while, which was scary. UK arms companies, we did a lot of work on them. My colleague Andrew wrote this book called The Shadow World, which is like the sort of, I think, one of the defining books about the way in which the global arms trade works,
right?
And the way it like corrupts our politics around the world. I wrote a book called Indefensible, which is about the arms trade and the arguments that are made to defend the arms trade and how they don't stand up. But always with like a solid like investigative line. And so I'd investigated British politics. And I'd gotten involved personally in Labour Party stuff. I mean, when I moved to the UK, this was like 2009. I thought like the Labour Party was generally speaking sort of politically my home, even though I didn't necessarily always agree with like the politics of the leaders.
Sure.
And, like Gordon Brown's probably a bit too right wing for me. But generally, I like always voted for the Labour Party. I was always involved, and like I did try to get involved at a local level. And then the thing that like really shifted for me, sort of the level of my engagement with British politics, was in 2017 when the Labour Party is led by Jeremy Corbyn. They published this manifesto, and one of the things in this manifesto, which was like really genuinely incredible, was basically a commitment to end secrecy in tax havens.
Right.
So, you obviously Britain effectively has all these subsidiary countries around the world, like the British
like
Virgin
Singapore
Islands
and things like that, or
more like British Virgin Islands, the Isle of Man, right? Where effectively they're technically independent, but they are effectively under British control,
right?
And these islands are a disaster, like a total disaster for global governance, because they specialize in basically secrecy. So you can go to the BVI, set up a company. The ownership of the company is totally secret. Loads of like tax evasion happens through there, but so much of like global corruption happens through these places because if you're a Russian oligarch, or you're like a South African politician or an Angolan politician, and you want to take a bribe, you form a company in the BVI. Right, because who's going to know? You can't. There's no way of finding out who owns their company, right? You get a company in the BVI and like a bank account in the BVI or bank account in Switzerland, and it'd be almost impossible to penetrate that.
Sure.
So this idea in this manifesto was, well, what we're going to do is we're going to publish a public register of these tax havens. Now, that would be like genuinely revolutionary around the world. Like if you suddenly knew like who owned all the companies in the BVI. Immediately you discover like 15 heads of state involved in corruption. There's so many corruption investigations where you follow big money, it ends up at the BVI and the trail ends.
Sure.
Right.
And is this a connection with Labour specifically, or is it every party? Are the Tories doing it as well?
I mean, the problem is that nobody has tackled the tax havens, like nobody at all. And this was the one time there was like actually like a promise from a political party to say, we're going to tackle tax haven secrecy.
And this was one of the reasons why Jeremy Corbyn was taken down in the first place. And there was
I mean, I think there's a part of, there's a whole discussion around why he was unpopular with the establishment. But that's really a big part of it. And that's the moment I became like very invested in this. Like I saw that as like as a narrow thing from my interests. Like this could change the world.
Right. So then how did that lead you to Labour Together and what they were doing?
So I got more involved in British politics. I followed it more closely. I started becoming more like active at a local level, like door knocking and stuff. And then my partner Jess, who's lovely, her family were quite closely connected to Jeremy Corbyn. So I was starting to understand a bit more about like how this movement operated as from the outside. But like the real change was when basically I lucked into this leak that came out in 2021. And it was this massive leak of documents out of the Labour Party, which had been leaked by whistleblowers who were concerned about like serious misconduct at the Labour Party. And it took quite a long time to go through all that material. But in that material, we started finding these individual emails. My partner Jess and me were looking at this stuff. And that's when we found these emails about Labour Together and about what they were doing behind the scenes. Because at the time, you know, for those that don't know the story, but basically, like, you know, when we found these emails, Labour Together looked like this really boring organization. Like if you Googled Labour Together in 2021, 2022, it just looked like the most boring think tank in the world. Affiliated with the Labour Party, trying to get everyone to talk and be nice to each other.
Yeah, their front was basically we're combining the right and the left side of Labour, bonding exercises.
Exactly.
Okay.
Like, let's meet around the coffee table and like talk about our feelings, right? And then like kumbaya, we'll all come together and end factionalism in the Labour Party. And then these emails we were seeing from behind the scenes, which were written, they came from the office of Steve Reed, who's now a cabinet secretary and like a very powerful member of this government, very key player in the book and part of Labour Together, describing things that Labour Together were doing at the time. You're like, this doesn't match the public persona at all. Like, what is going on here? This is not what it looked like on the tin.
And this was the first time that the £700,000 was discovered, or it was discovered before that? Because I know there was the whole thing where, was it the Electoral Commission came in and was like, what are you doing? And they're like, well, technically we don't count as this. Was that before, or were the leaks what led to that?
So the leaks led to us understanding that a bit more. So basically you had between 2017 and 2020, Labour Together takes in like £1 million in donations. I think it's 850,000. Between 2018 and 2020, £730,000 aren't declared. So under electoral law, every donation, if you're what's called a members association, which Labour Together are, any donation over £7,500, you have to report to the Electoral Commission, which means that anybody can just go onto the Electoral Commission's website and search Labour Together and see who's donating. Right? And that money's not reported.
And they didn't declare themselves as a members commission or association?
They tried to argue with the Electoral Commission they weren't a members association, which they were.
Okay.
Now, we'd known, because the Electoral Commission investigated them in 2021 and found them guilty. So we knew they'd broken the law, right? But the public version of events that Labour Together had given was, this was just an administrative oversight. Now, the documents that we uncovered started raising questions about that. Right. And the key thing was, is it possible that actually Morgan McSweeney, who was the company secretary of Labour Together, and then became chief of staff to Keir Starmer, and for a long time was probably the most influential person in British politics who nobody had ever heard of, whether there was a choice that was made not to report the donation. So they could pursue this project via Labour Together, which was very secretive, in secret, without being discovered. And then the other thing was, when Labour Together were put under investigation by the Electoral Commission, did they tell the Electoral Commission everything? Were they candid with their answers? And the documents I found basically suggested there were reasonable questions to suggest maybe not. And that's what we started pulling the string. And then I started doing FOIs to the Electoral Commission and getting more information. And basically what we come out of that investigation, what we now know very clearly is that Morgan McSweeney doesn't report this money, but it's very clear that Morgan McSweeney was told by the Electoral Commission on multiple occasions that he had to report that money. So there's no way he can argue he didn't know, that he simply forgot.
Is there any capacity within campaigning within Britain where you don't have to report donations? Is there anything else they could have labelled themselves where they don't have to, or is that always? I feel like it should always be a legal requirement, but I don't know if that's the case.
I mean, if you're not a member, so their technicality would be if they're not a members association, right? Which is a specific thing in law here. There's this very complicated piece of legislation called the Political Parties and Representation of People Act or something like that. And it's very detailed. But the key thing is that one of the things that I uncovered by doing FOIs to the Electoral Commission, so the documents I discovered led me on this trail, and I submitted these FOIs to find out more. And what these FOIs showed was Morgan McSweeney called the Electoral Commission personally in 2017 and said, I don't think that we should report donations. We don't campaign. We're not a members association. I don't want to report donations. And the Electoral Commission then wrote back to Morgan McSweeney and said, no, you are definitely a members association. You have to report donations. This is how you report donations. These are the forms you fill in. And then they actually have correspondence over a period of time where they're telling him how to fill in forms, and he's clearly acknowledging that he has to report donations, right? So there's no way that Morgan McSweeney can say, I wasn't told I had to report donations, that I was unaware of the law. It's clear that he knows. Right. And then the other problem is that they're also telling people they're reporting donations, right? So in public, they have a website, and the website says we're reporting donations.
Sure.
There's an article in February 2020 by Shabana Mahmood, who's now the Home Secretary, on behalf of Labour Together, saying we're reporting donations. There's meetings in Parliament where MPs have said they told us they're reporting donations, right? So you have a situation where you have an organisation where Morgan McSweeney has been told he has to report donations. They're telling everyone they're reporting donations, but then they don't report donations. And then when they put it under investigation for not reporting donations, it's not so clear that they were candid about everything that happened, but they basically chose potentially not to tell the Electoral Commission everything that they should have.
Yeah.
Right.
I think that's an important distinction as well, because you talk in the book about politicians who knew they were on the inside and they might have known, and other people might not have known. They were just told by Morgan McSweeney and whoever else was running Labour Together that they were reporting.
Yeah.
So they just repeated what they were told.
Absolutely.
And there's no responsibility to check that that's happening, essentially, within Labour.
And what happens is that, so even there's a director of Labour Together, this other MP called John Cruddas, who I spoke to for the book, and he was like, I had no idea this stuff was happening. He just thought everything was like ticking along fine.
Sure.
But the other thing that makes it complicated is that it's not just that there's this issue around the money. It's like, what is the money used for, right? And the money is used for like two very key things. One is it effectively gets Keir Starmer elected leader of the Labour Party.
Sure.
Because Morgan McSweeney is taking this huge pot of money that he's not declaring, and he's paying for all this internal polling in the party, finding out exactly where the membership is. And from July 2019, which is 6 months before the general elections, even going to be called, maybe 4 months before the elections called, he is meeting with Keir Starmer, planning a leadership bid. Like, this is how you will present yourself to the membership to win an eventual leadership challenge. But in order to create the context for a leadership challenge, he's also working secretly to destroy the possibility of a Corbyn-led Labour government succeeding.
Sure.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's where it gets like really ugly, because they start doing like really problematic stuff behind the scenes, totally covertly, not cleared in public at all, to effectively destroy the reputation and ability of the left of the Labour Party to function. And it gets very ugly and very complicated. It strays into territory that I didn't particularly want to stray into myself, which is this like very controversial anti-Semitism crisis that like
which I think is still affecting Jeremy Corbyn now with your party.
Sure.
People are still calling him an anti-Semite.
Sure.
And there was I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit to you said that in the book there were real claims of anti-Semitism within the Labour Party, but generally it was overstated. And there was even moments when they were accusing Jewish MPs of being anti-Semitic, which is just mental.
Yeah. I mean, you have a situation where, like, and it's clear, because I've seen the Labour Party files, like I've seen the complaints files, I've seen instances, like very clear instances of like outright clear anti-Semitism, right? Like Holocaust denial, like Rothschild conspiracies.
Sure.
Right?
Is that? Do you find that that's any more so in the Labour Party than in the Tories, the Greens, or Reform?
Nobody has ever properly done a comparative study, because that's the point, right? Because while this stuff was happening, people doing deep dives into Labour Party members. Nobody's doing the same thing for the Tories.
Sure.
Right? Nobody's looking into this stuff. But generally speaking, where there have been surveys and polls and stuff that have been done about particular attitudes towards Jews and Israel and that sort of stuff.
Sure.
Generally speaking, it's pretty much universal across the political spectrum, right? The incidents of anti-Semitism that you discover in political parties. Actually, some of the surveys that were done in sort of 2018 showed slightly less anti-Semitic ideals or anti-Semitic ideas in the Labour Party than in other political parties, right?
Which is interesting, because with the Labour files with Al Jazeera as well, that was all about. It was a little bit about this, but it was more about the influence of Israeli lobbyists within the Labour Party.
Sure.
So it's in momentum and sort of them building people up from the start. So it's interesting that that's got that connection, but nonetheless there is all these accusations of...
And what you find, I mean, the problem that you have is that you have this like extremely serious issue, because anti-Semitism is like this deep and profound issue that we all have to take seriously. But you also have this political project that is not declaring its money, that's undertaking a covert war against Jeremy Corbyn, that is like factionally hates the left wing of the Labour Party. It absolutely hates it. And it's also inserting itself into the anti-Semitism crisis. Now that's very problematic in and of itself. But then you check at the allegations they're behind, you fact check them, and you find that they don't really stand up, right? And there's some like really ugly stuff that they get involved in, which I can describe in a bit. But what comes clear from looking at this stuff is that there was a guy called Martin Ford who was asked by the Labour Party to investigate issues of racism and anti-Semitism in the Labour Party.
Sure.
And his view, I think, is the right one, which is like anti-Semitism is real. Anti-Semitism is a real issue in the Labour Party. But basically got caught up in this mad factional war.
Right.
And there were two things that resulted. One is that some people on the left treated every allegation of anti-Semitism as if it was untrue or made in bad faith, when it wasn't.
When you say the left, you mean the left within Labour?
Within Labour Party.
Sure.
So like the Corbynite left, if you will.
Okay.
Some people say, like every allegation as like a false flag, right? When actually it was a bit more mixed. There were true allegations and there were false allegations. There were bad allegations made in good faith,
sure,
right? Like, because it's a complicated issue, right? But then on the right of the Labour Party, which is sort of a Blairite political mode that really can't stand the Corbynites, there is a political advantage to expanding the scope of what could be considered anti-Semitic and also creating the impression that like anti-Semitism has like absolutely overridden this party, like it's totally lousy with anti-Semitism and it's irredeemable, and that actually that anti-Semitism flows for something that's like deep and inherent in left-wing ideology, right? And what that means is that the scope of what gets considered anti-Semitic expands and expands and expands and expands and expands to include things like actually quite reasonable criticism of Israel,
sure,
right? Becomes considered anti-Semitic to the point where anybody expressing like a robust opinion about Israel then gets accused of anti-Semitism. Usually, and then it gets investigated and it doesn't stand up. And the problem with that, of course, is that there's loads of Jewish people who are, one, very concerned at the way in which anti-Semitism is playing out in the Labour Party. They're worried that it's being used in like a politically instrumental way. But they're also concerned, there are also lots of anti-Zionist Jews or like non-Zionist Jews or Jewish people who have like an ambivalent relationship to Israel,
sure,
who are criticizing Israel or expressing support for Palestinian solidarity, and they being accused of anti-Semitism, right?
And I feel like it's a whole problem now as well. Like people are starting to see that more now than ever.
I mean, it is a real problem, like the extent to which, you have left-wing Jewish people accused of anti-Semitism. And actually one of the perverse outcomes of the anti-Semitism crisis in the Labour Party is that it's become like an actively hostile place for anti-Zionist Jews, or like actively hostile. If you're anti-Zionist and you're a Jewish person, you are made to feel unwelcome in the Labour Party.
And that's basically, I mean, it was the main argument that took down Jeremy Corbyn, right? That the Labour Party was rife with anti-Semitism and he was worse than the rest. And I can't remember what the claim was in the book, but there was something he said that was taken out of context. When he was speaking at an event and they took it out of context and made it sound like he was anti-Semitic when he was just talking about, I think, Israeli donors to the Labour Party.
So
what
he was talking about there was this very specific famous incident where he made a comment about it's called like the English irony moment, right? It was this huge political scandal where there's an old video that surfaces of Jeremy Corbyn talking to an event where he says he's talking about something that happened at a previous meeting, and he says these people who come to this meeting beforehand had been disruptive. They had, raised issues with the Palestinian ambassador, who had made an ironic comment. The Palestinian ambassador had made an ironic comment. And Jeremy Corbyn says, the Zionists in the room clearly don't understand English irony, right? And that was taken to mean like all Zionists don't get English irony, which is like plainly not what he's saying. He's saying these four, and he says these four Zionists in the room, and he calls them Zionists explicitly because these are four very well-known individuals in like the pro-Israel movement on like a grassroots level in the UK, right? Who go to meetings repeatedly in Parliament. Jeremy Corbyn knows personally because he's had plenty of run-ins with them. So he's saying like these specific people here don't get English irony, and it's a joke. It's a silly little joke, right? And that's taken to mean like he's saying that all Jewish people aren't actually English in some deep and profound way, which is not what happened at all. And that's like one example of these like mad allegations being taken seriously. The one that I write about sort of in more detail in the book is this councillor called Jo Bird, who I think is a good illustrative example of how this is a mad situation. So she's a Jewish councillor, right? And she was a part of the Labour Party, and she gives this interview. She's doing an event, and she makes a joke because one of the problems that you had in the Labour Party was that people would complain about anti-Semitism, and then the party would discipline people,
Right.
And it wasn't particularly well run, this disciplinary system. Like, it wasn't working properly. And she says at this meeting, what we want is a disciplinary system that embodies the values of natural justice, due process, what I call due process. Right?
Okay.
She's making a play on words,
Yeah.
but about Jewishness in a positive way. She's like, I want this to be more like my Jewish values, which is about natural justice. And then the story gets reported the next day, which is Labour councillor makes an anti-Semitic joke.
Yeah.
She clearly hasn't made an anti-Semitic joke, right? She's also Jewish. And that happens, sadly, in the midst of like real allegations of anti-Semitism. There's also nonsense like that. Like genuine nonsense, where it's just like, this is ridiculous. Like, newspapers who are reporting this are being silly, right? And the people who think this is people who are making these sorts of allegations, they need to be examined. You need to be like, why are you making this allegation? This clearly doesn't stand up in a sort of meaningful way.
And the Labour Together obviously took down, we'll talk about it in a little bit, but taking down the Canary.
Yeah.
I think you talk about it a little bit in the book, but I'm curious if you know what impact Labour Together had on the reporting in this case.
Oh, huge.
Or was it just
huge.
Journalists from different massive news organisations taking things out of context regularly and sort of spinning a story for clicks?
I mean, what you have with Labour Together is a Morgan McSweeney and this guy he works with very closely called Imran Ahmed, who's also from the Labour Party, also deeply factional, really doesn't like the left. And from at least 2018 onwards, Imran Ahmed and Morgan McSweeney are working with big papers, placing stories about the anti-Semitism crisis, right, without any disclosure. There's nobody knows they're doing this stuff. And the problem is when you go look at the reporting that then follows from it, it's problematic. It's not great, right? So the example I use in the book is the first sort of big intervention they make in the anti-Semitism crisis.
Right.
There's an article that's published in April 2018, I think it is, or March 2018, called Corbyn's Hate Factories.
Right.
Which is in the front page of the Sunday Times, and it's a big front page story in the Sunday Times with like inside cover stuff. Like really, they've gone all out on this. And what had happened was that Morgan McSweeney and this guy Imran Ahmed had basically sat in Corbyn supporting Facebook groups, searching through all of these groups, trying to find all instances they could find of anti-Semitism, bullying, homophobia, anti-black racism, and they say they find 2,000 posts, 2,000 posts on this that suggest
well, it's not their responsibility to moderate these groups. They've got more important things to do than, even if they are genuine anti-Semitic comments, which I don't think they were for the most part from what you discovered.
It's a bit of a mixture, right? This is the problem. So first of all, we don't know what 2,000 comments they discovered. We just have to take on their word they found 2,000. But then you look at the actual
examples. It wasn't MPs either, right? It was just people in Facebook groups.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, the thing is, these Facebook groups are huge. There's like hundreds of thousands of members. There's millions of posts across them, right? And so there's somebody who runs one of these groups who says like, yeah, there's obviously 2,000 posts as a problem, but we do moderate these groups actively. Like we try to find every example and deal with them. Across the period of time where they found these 2,000 messages, there were approximately, I think they said something like 8 million messages posted, right? So like it's a tiny fraction of the number. But then you actually look at the examples they provide of what the questionable content is, and it's like some of it is plainly anti-Semitic, and that's a problem that needs to be moderated, and some of it isn't. Right. So one example they give is that a woman by the name of Naomi Wimborne-Idrissi posted one of these groups. I worry that the anti-Semitism crisis in the Labour Party is being pursued by undeclared right-wing actors. Which is literally what's happening in this case.
Was that at the time of your reporting, or was that before that all came out? This woman just suspected. This person just suspected.
They just reported in the Sunday Times story. Like they just reported she said this. What they don't disclose in the Sunday Times story is that Naomi Wimborne-Idrissi is Jewish.
Right.
So you have a Jewish person on a Facebook group saying, "I'm worried that the anti-Semitism crisis is being used by right-wing actors in the Labour Party to score political points." And that's being reported on in the national newspaper as a result of an undeclared right-wing political project trying to use anti-Semitism to score political points.
Sure.
Right. She's literally actually divining the truth and reporting it as a Jewish person. And yet she is part of this factories of hate. And it does seem like they are very deeply involved in working like across the media spectrum in placing stories and managing sources. Yeah, so they play a very big role.
David Goldstein, was it? The fake Elias that
was that. So that's another example of like where this crisis went crazy, right? So in March 2019, one of the things that Labour Together does, or Morgan McSweeney and Imran Ahmed do, is they start this very problematic campaign called Stop Funding Fake News.
Right.
Right. Now, in the Labour Party at the time, according to Morgan McSweeney's own analysis, is that, they saw it as their job to destroy or undermine the things that they think made Corbynism sustainable in the Labour Party.
Sure.
Right. And one of the things they identified was like an independent media ecosystem. Right. So the Canary starts up in 2016, is left-leaning, is pro-Corbyn, it's generally seen as quite influential in the 2017 general election.
Sure.
As building support for Corbynism, and one of the reasons why Labour Party does better than expected. And Morgan McSweeney sets out to destroy them, right? Because he's like, you can't have this. And they start this thing called Stop Funding Fake News, where they say the Canary is knowingly publishing misleading stories and lies to create hate, which is like an incredibly defamatory thing to say, like madly defamatory thing to say. And they also say the Canary publishes anti-Semitic content, and you go look at the material, and it's like, what are they doing that's anti-Semitic is conducting interviews with non-conformist anti-Zionist Jews.
Right.
And the thing that's messed up about Stop Funding Fake News is that at the time when it's launched, there's no disclosure at all who's behind it. They just present themselves as a group of citizen activists, just like ordinary people fighting hate, when actually it's Morgan McSweeney, who's the director of Labour Together.
Yeah.
Half the time that he's involved in this stuff, he's also helping Keir Starmer run for a leadership bid. It's Imran Ahmed, who's a former Labour Party employee, now runs this thing called the Centre for Countering Digital Hate, which is a big part of the Twitter files. Then you have Steve Reed, who's a sitting cabinet minister, who said, who endorses this project, and has said that he was involved in some way. So it's hardly a group of grassroots activists, and it's extremely successful. Like, it destroys the Canary.
Sure.
Like, it's designed to make sure that that the Canary loses all its advertising money, and it succeeds. They create this massive firestorm on Twitter in particular, where brands are put under a huge amount of pressure to withdraw their funding. Now, it actually turns out you don't need that much support to create a sense of a Twitter storm. And one of the things that Stop Funding Fake News draws on is that there's a group that already exists that precedes Stop Funding Fake News called Labour Against Anti-Semitism.
Right.
Which is a group of, around about 50 people. We don't know everybody who's involved, but sort of this loose affiliation of people who've taken it upon themselves to, in their words, fight anti-Semitism in the Labour Party, right? And they've become quite influential in this time. There's quite a lot of news stories if you go look back. Labour Against Anti-Semitism says this, Labour Against Anti-Semitism says that. And one of the things that Labour Against Anti-Semitism does is support the Stop Funding Fake News campaign, right? Now, why is that problematic? You mentioned David Goldstein, because one of the spokespeople of Labour Against Anti-Semitism is this guy called Ewan Phillips. And Ewan Phillips, again, quoted a lot in the media and is treated as like a reasonable and reliable arbiter of what constitutes anti-Semitism. And what we now know from the Labour Party files is that he creates this identity, this alias called David Goldstein, which most people would take to be like a Jewish sounding name. Of course, he said, just to put it on the record, he said, I never intended to sound Jewish or pretend to be Jewish when I used the name David Goldstein. I mean, people can make of that what they will. But the thing that's really interesting about David Goldstein is that David Goldstein is used repeatedly to make allegations of anti-Semitism against Jewish people. That's the thing I find in the Labour files that's really interesting, is just dozens and dozens and dozens of complaints against Jewish people who are accused of anti-Semitism by David Goldstein.
Right.
And these are, excuse my language, these are fucked up stories, right? So the one story I tell in the book, which I think explains how mad the anti-Semitism crisis went, is a woman by the name of Riva Jaffe, who I knew locally, actually, because she's from Camden.
All right.
And she had rejoined the Labour Party in, I think it was 2016. She's got this incredibly interesting background. Her parents had fled anti-Semitic persecution in Eastern Europe. They moved to South Africa. They became involved in like the anti-apartheid struggle. Okay. They joined the Communist Party. Her father was actually interned in a jail during World War II as a like seditious actor, and was effectively, was brutally treated by the camp guards there, and also by some of his fellow inmates, because he was a Jewish man, but he was actually interned alongside Nazis, like literal Nazis in South Africa, and they treated him terribly. And then he came to the UK with his family. And then the family became like their family home became the hub for the anti-apartheid struggle.
Sure.
Right? So Reva Joffe is born to this family, is raised in London, is raised in like the crucible of the anti-apartheid struggle, and she is like a lovely woman, respected psychoanalyst. And in 2021, she receives a notice of investigation from the Labour Party saying, you've been put under investigation for anti-Semitism. And the complaint against her is that she chaired a poster for BDS, anti-apartheid, for the boycott, divestment and sanctions campaign, right, which calls people to boycott Israel in order to try and end the apartheid there. And it's modeled on the boycott campaign that worked in South Africa. And she's asked to respond to this allegation that is anti-Semitic. Now, when she gets this notice of investigation, she's basically on her deathbed. She's got like a terminal illness. And she has to spend like the last moments of her life writing a letter to the Labour Party explaining like, this is mad. Like, what are you doing? Like, I'm plainly not anti-Semitic. I'm Jewish. This is my background.
Yeah.
It's perfectly reasonable for a Jewish person to criticize Israel and to support these policies to try and affect change there. And she dies under investigation of the Labour Party. Now, the mad part of the story is that her son, who's been told about this, tries to get the Labour Party to like clear her after she's dead, posthumously tried to say like, this is very deeply offensive to our family to have her die under this pall of suspicion that she, as a Jewish woman, is anti-Semitic because she made one Facebook post, right? And the party has never responded to him, never given him an answer. Like, there's been letters written directly to Keir Starmer saying, she was in your constituency, you knew her personally, you knew Reva Joffe, you know she's an anti-Semitic. Can you please resolve this? And they've never got a response. And the mad thing is that one of the emails that prompts the investigation into her is submitted by David Goldstein. So you have a non-Jewish man using a Jewish-sounding identity to file a complaint against anti-Semitism against a Jewish woman who's investigated for anti-Semitism on her deathbed.
Right.
Like, that's like the perverse outcome of this crisis. Like, that is the untold story that doesn't get told, I think, in the mainstream media about what this crisis actually looked like at a deep level and how problematic it was. Right. So you have Morgan McSweeney's campaign, Stop Funding Fake News, and one of the people who's supporting it is David Goldstein. Literally, one of the things that I uncovered, the thing that blew my mind when I was investigating this stuff, the first success that Stop Funding Fake News ever has is getting Macmillan Cancer Charity to withdraw its advertising from the Canary.
Right.
And it's in response to a message that being posted online targeting Macmillan by David Goldstein. It's like a fake identity is being used to basically destroy a legitimate newspaper. Now, this is the Canary is a legitimate. You don't have to agree with their approach. Like, I don't agree with their editorial line most of the time, but they're a legitimate news organization. Like, it's regulated by Impress. They have, almost all of their journalists are members of the National Union of Journalists.
Sure.
They're producing factually accurate content that anybody can complain about the regulator if it's not true. People can sue them for libel if it's not true. Like, this is a proper news organization.
And they were regularly correcting things that were wrong and responding to every single complaint that they got. Yeah.
So when they do get complaints in, they immediately, I give us one example in the book. It's like, Stop Funding Fake News says, oh, look at this one Impress adjudication against you. Impress is their regulator. And I say, well, what you're actually saying is that this organization has agreed to be regulated. And when it makes a mistake, it corrects it, right? And actually, all of the examples of fake news that are then put up on by the Canary, they just don't check out, right? Like, you actually fact check them, and what the Stop Funding Fake News is saying is nonsense. What you effectively have is like a misinformation campaign being run by Morgan McSweeney against legitimate newspaper outlets to destroy them.
It's so twisted.
It's
the
totally
idea
twisted.
of silencing genuine Jewish people on the claim that they're anti-Semitic is just horrendous.
It really is gross. I mean, the problem is that, as I've sort of personally discovered over the last couple of months, is that this attitude towards independent journalism, towards accountability journalism, is very profound as part of this political project, right? So one of the things that I've had to deal with is that as I started reporting these stories, right? So I started reporting on Stop Funding Fake News and CCDH with Matt Taibbi in the States, who've been doing stuff on Twitter.
Yeah, I'd love you to speak on that as well,
Yeah,
because that's a crazy story. I think that's actually maybe where I first heard your name, because I've been following him for a while. I think he's absolutely brilliant.
Yeah.
One of the few people who I pretty much agree with every single thing he says. And the Twitter files, and still nobody knows about it. And it was absolutely mental. So I'm wondering what your capacity was in that.
Yeah, I mean, the Twitter files is really interesting. and went to really interesting places. So basically what Twitter Files does is that there is this moment that happens in American politics around about 2020, 2021, where for various reasons, complicated reasons, part of it's because like Trump is terrifying.
Sure.
And part of it's because of COVID,
Yeah.
right? Which is like this unique global event. And there's like real concerns around like, what does like medical misinformation do to people? And in this moment, there are political actors who are like, we should start think maybe, America, they have like the First Amendment, like free speech is like absolutely like one of the key central features of American politics in a way that isn't actually reflected. It's interesting to me because it's not really reflected anywhere else in the world.
Despite what Keir Starmer says, it's not really reflected here, I don't
Not really.
Yeah.
Like, we don't have like, obviously free speech is an important principle here, but it's not like baked into people's bones in the way it is in America, right? Like this idea that everyone should be able to say what they think.
Sure.
Right? Like even if it's offensive, you should be able to say what you think. And what you have in 2020, 2021 is there are political operatives generally aligned with the Democratic Party who are starting to say, well, maybe actually the state should be getting involved in moderating speech. Like maybe the state should be trying to correct misinformation. And the problem is that, first of all, in America, that's like seen as a serious overreach.
Yeah.
Right? Like this idea that the White House could be reaching out to social media companies to tell them people can and can't say this online, even if it's true or not
and
true.
It was tied in with what the FBI, intelligence agencies as well, just silencing
Just
people for
massive
asking questions.
Yeah, and for like mad stuff, right? So sort of alleging that people are part of like a Russian influence campaign because they have
they pulled that back out again, the whole Russian hoax thing, which they discredited in the Supreme Court. They said that wasn't true. They knew that there was Russian meddling in the election, but it wasn't alongside Trump as they said it was.
And one of the key things is like it's COVID stuff. So it's like, for me, like it's a really interesting. So I'm not like a COVID denialist or anything, but there is an interesting part of the COVID discussion, which is about the origins of COVID, this lab leak. Now I have no idea.
I don't think anyone knows.
Nobody knows, right? But at the time, there is this discussion about, does it come from a lab or is it zoonotic? Does it transmit from like bats in Wuhan?
Yeah, and how dangerous is it? Should we actually be locking down based on it?
There's lots of debates, right?
Yeah.
And basically, what you have happen is that it's now generally, I think, relatively widely accepted that there are two competing theories of equal value. That people can marshal different evidence around about where COVID came from. Sure. Some people believe it's a lab leak. Some good scientists believe it's a lab leak. Some good scientists believe it's zoonotic, right?
And actually, at the end of the day, it doesn't really change the countries, depending on the country. It doesn't change a policy on how you lock down or anything.
It doesn't.
It's
at
just
all.
asking questions.
And people were targeted for saying, we think it's a lab leak. That was treated as a form of misinformation.
Sure.
And their speech was censored. Now, 3-4 years down the line, we now know that this is actually a much more live academic, scientific debate, right? But one of the organizations that's involved in shutting down those discussions is this offshoot of Stop Funding Fake News called CCDH, right? So one of the things that happens after Corbyn is destroyed is you have Imran Ahmed basically goes to the US. And he creates this thing called the Center for Countering Digital Hate, CCDH, which is an offshoot, as he's admitted, it's an offshoot of Stop Funding Fake News and gets created from it. And he gets really involved in America.
Yeah.
Like, becomes a massive player in American politics. And he publishes this report called the Disinformation Dozen, which is about 12 people that he says are responsible for the majority of disinformation about COVID online.
Right.
And I don't know how accurate that stuff is. I'm not a scientist, I don't know, right? But politically what it means is that CCDH gets picked up by the Biden White House and starts being quoted, and they start becoming this big player. And they are playing quite an important role because there is this growing complex of organizations that get created in the state and outside of the state in America about trying to manage social media. Like what can and can't be said on social media, which in America is a very complicated position to be in. Like, it's fine. I think most Americans would say it's fine for like a think tank or something to like pressure a social media company around stuff. It's not fine for the White House to be involved in that stuff. Like, the White House shouldn't be telling social media companies what is and isn't true and what to report. Because for obvious reasons, right?
Especially a lot of it was like shadow banning, so people didn't even know that their tweets or their YouTube videos were being silenced. Obviously, it was the thing where like if you mentioned COVID or the lab leak in a video, people were taken down and demonetized, which is horrible. But a lot of people didn't even know that they were being censored.
Yeah, and what we find is that in this case you had CCDH is sort of working with this complex, what they call the disinformation complex, that Matt Taibbi starts reporting on.
Yeah.
And what the thing he gets access to, which is really interesting, is that obviously Elon Musk buys Twitter. Now, I'm no fan of Elon Musk or his politics, but the thing that he does is he says, well, I'm going to open up some of these files to investigative reporters. And there's a couple of independent investigative reporters from across the political spectrum. Matt has seen a sort of more left-wing, and they're basically allowed to view these files.
Yeah.
And in these files, they start seeing all this material about the ways in which this disinformation and misinformation complex is interacting with the White House, how the White House is interacting with Twitter to try and manage the scale and content of American speech online.
Yeah, and the way it practically played out, it was essentially the White House or the FBI messaging secretly, and these were the leaks, secretly messaging heads of Twitter and being like, oh, not that tweet, not that person, shut that off.
And here's a network of actors we believe are affiliated with Russia, right?
Yeah.
We've done a network analysis. These people are probably Russian bots. And then you actually find them, it's a woman from Arkansas.
Yeah.
Right, who just has kooky opinions.
Yeah,
right?
Which Twitter has the ability to research as well.
Exactly, and so this is where I start working on this story with CCDH. Is that I basically go, and in 2023 I do two things. One is I approach the Sunday Times here, and I say I've got these documents about the money. I'm really concerned about this money that wasn't declared. This money that was basically used to make Keir Starmer the Prime Minister of at the time almost Prime Minister of the country, but leader of the Labour Party. I think there's real issues around whether they're meant to maybe not report the donations and whether they were telling the truth to the Electoral Commission when they were put under investigation. At the same time, I went to Matt Taibbi and I said, I've been reading your reporting about this. And I thought that he was quite interesting, the way that he was understanding the way in which this worked. Now, the problem is in America, right, is the stuff around the Twitter files and the stuff that Matt was revealing was that it got ghettoized politically.
Right.
So in America, it was understood as a right-wing thing. It's like right-wing people are raising issues of free speech and it's nonsense. And the thing that was interesting about the CCDH example for Matt and for me is that actually the first time this was pioneered wasn't against the right-wing, it was against the left-wing.
Right.
Because Stop Funding Fake News' first target is primarily the left wing. CCDH's first target is primarily the left wing, not exclusively. But it's about, Morgan McSweeney is part of a project to destroy the prospects of a Corbyn-led Labour Party. Sure. And he's also involved in this stuff, right? So from an American perspective, that was quite interesting for them. And part of the reason I went to Matt to write these stories was to basically try and get, in America, people to understand that this wasn't a left-right issue. This wasn't a partisan issue.
Yeah.
This is a non-partisan issue because this sort of thing is generally used to shut down all sorts of non-conformist speech on the right and the left.
Yeah.
Right. And the way we've seen it in America is that in America, where it plays out is around people, around COVID, around other political issues. On the left here, it's around things like Palestine and Israel. That where there's been a serious attempt to shut down speech around that.
Sure.
Okay. And that's where I started talking to Matt about this stuff. But then, little do I realize, it's like, I start publishing that stuff. Sunday Times does this piece in November 2023, and then Matt does his first piece on Labour on Imran Ahmed and CCDH, mentioning Labour Together at the same time, and I write some articles for him. And the response from Labour Together is mad. So at the time, this is after Morgan McSweeney's left. He's now sort of in the Labour Party. The Labour Party is months away from winning. Everybody knows they're going to win the next general election.
Sure.
Right? So these articles come out, and it's a problem for them because it's like, oh, there's a problem with this money. They make Keir Starmer leader. There's this weird program that they started running. Stop Funding Fake News. This doesn't look great. And what Labour Together do is they hire a firm called APCO Worldwide.
Right.
Which is a reputation management firm. It's a massive multinational firm.
Yes.
Huge.
Can you explain the types of people their usual client list?
Right. So their usual client list is big multinational companies, a lot of whom are not very nice. So one of their clients is Elbit Systems. And Elbit Systems is an Israeli weapons manufacturer, right? Which is involved in, what's been happening in Gaza recently. So not the nicest people, right? And APCO, we've now actually seen this contract. I didn't know about it at the time. I didn't know any of this stuff was happening at the time. But now the contract has been published, underlying between APCO and Labour Together. And it says very explicitly that what APCO will do for Labour Together is develop a package of materials that will proactively undermine the reporting of Paul Holden and Matt Taibbi. Right? Proactively undermine what they call Paul Holden and Matt Taibbi's concerted attacks on Labour Together. But they're not attacks on Labour Together. They are factually accurate public interest reporting about powerful people.
And so how does is this sort of practically undermining your funders? Like, how do they go about doing this?
So what they do is that they do this mad investigation into us, right? And they're basically trying to figure out what can be used to undermine me.
Dirt. Yeah.
Digging dirt. The problem is there is no dirt
Glasgow
on me.
DJ days.
Exactly. The problem is there's no dirt.
You were teetotal.
I was teetotal. Like, there's no dirt on me. Like, the worst thing you can say about me is that for a period of time, like, I was like way too obsessed with Italo disco. Like, that was it.
I love Italo disco.
There you go, right?
I got really obsessed with it at one point. Do you, like, when you find out that this is going on, obviously there's nothing to find, but do you just sit and stay up at night and think about everything that you've done and what could they possibly use against you? And
yeah, I mean, it was disturbing. So we've only really recently found out precisely what they did.
Yeah,
right?
It was a couple of months ago.
A month ago, we found out like the scale and the scope of the investigation. There's still loads of stuff I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm still waiting for documents. I've got what's called a subject access request in with Labour Together and APCO. I'm still waiting to find out everything. But what they do is, they go deep. They like find out who my family are.
Yeah.
Now, that stuff I keep really private. So I don't have any social media where I have put up any photos of my family. I don't even mention my partner's name. Now I do because it's been outed. But and part of the reason is because when I was in South Africa doing anti-corruption work, it got hairy, right? Like, it got... And I didn't want bad actors in South Africa to know who my family are.
Sure.
So if I go back to South Africa, I don't want bad actors to know what my partner's name is. Because we've had experiences in South Africa. My colleague Andrew used to go through passport control in South Africa. And as he got through passport control, as he passed was getting his bag, you get a call from like the head of intelligence being like, we know you're in the country.
Right.
This is not stuff you mess around with. Okay, so we kept that very private. And I was disturbed to find that they use this thing called Trace IQ, which is like this big data aggregator to basically find out where I lived, who I lived with, and they map my family. And effectively what they do, the maddest thing they do, is that they then hire they subcontract this mad person who then writes this crazy report about me and my colleague Andrew, where this report says that I'm secretly a South African intelligence agent, or like connected to South African intelligence, and through this I'm getting leaks from Russia.
Okay.
Right.
It's always the same playbook.
It's always the same playbook. It's mad stuff. I did think to myself, I was like, can you not think of something new?
Yeah.
Like a new allegation that's like, what's it vaguely...
Give me the decency of giving me something other than Russian. Yeah.
Also give me something that's vaguely credible.
Yeah.
Like, if you look at me and Andrew, like, our whole career is based on, like, investigating the South African state for corruption.
Sure.
Right? We've investigated Russian oligarchs. Andrew's book, we write about how we can't go to Russia because we've been threatened.
Yeah.
Right?
It's going to be like photoshops of you and Vladimir Putin.
It's just nonsense.
Sat having a coffee.
Exactly. Like, this is so mad, this allegation. It's so bizarre and so stupid. I'm like, the one piece of consolation is that at least they wasted their money. They spent loads of money on this nonsense, right?
Yeah. What have they said about you?
So the one thing they said about me is that I'm part of a pro-Kremlin network of actors,
right?
And that I've got these South African intelligence links, and that as a result, the materials that I'm using for my investigation potentially emanate from a hack undertaken by Russia or Russian state actors,
sure.
Which is not true. My leak comes from the Labour Party, from whistleblowers, like the cleanest, most legally executed.
It's funny because as you're discrediting certain things the South African government is doing, it's ridiculous to claim that you're somehow intelligent at the same time.
Mad, absolutely, like totally, genuinely insane. Insane to think that stuff, right? And the problem is they don't just get this report; they then use this report. So one of the things that happens that after I've done the story with the Sunday Times, I'm working on a follow-up story with the Telegraph. I've got new documents out of the Electoral Commission. I've done a Freedom of Information request. I've got new documents that I spoke to about earlier, about McSweeney calling the Electoral Commission, them telling him he has to report this stuff.
Yeah.
I'm also just about to report a new story in America about CCDH. And the angle about that is, A, the way in which McSweeney and other people in Labour Together had helped to create CCDH. The other thing I'm reporting is about when CCDH forms the United States, they submit forms to the IRS.
Okay.
And the forms they submit to the IRS has misleading content in it. So I'm basically saying, well, actually the IRS needs to investigate CCDH for giving misleading information.
Right.
It's a serious offense in America, right? And then in response to those stories and in response to like all the stuff happening, Labour Together report me to GCHQ. Right, so they report me to this thing called the National Cybersecurity Centre. And they send in a note saying, we want you to investigate the possibility that poor Holden is receiving hacks that targeted Labour Together from the Electoral Commission. And here's a dossier. And they basically submit a version of this report. Now, the problem with this report is, in addition to going after me, in addition to going after my colleague Andrew, it also goes after these Sunday Times journalists.
Right.
It also investigates this very well-respected journalist called Gabriel Pogrund, who I worked with on the story in 2023, who's written his own book about, Labour Together and Morgan McSweeney, and his colleague, a guy called Harry York. And I haven't seen what they write about Gabriel Pogrund, but it's apparently incredibly offensive, right? Again, weirdly enough, going after him because he's Jewish and they sort of misrepresent his ethnicity and what he believes about it. Very ugly stuff. And it creates this, this basically comes out last month, the fact that this report exists and it's been distributed. And at a certain stage, Labour Together is even trying to get a story placed in The Guardian saying I'm under investigation by the National Cybersecurity Centre. That's the first time I hear about it. In February 2024, I get this email from The Guardian saying, we're about to run a story saying you're under investigation. And I was like, what the earth are you talking about? This is mad. This is nonsense.
So then what happens to you now? Do you go to court over this?
Defamation? I basically threatened them with defamation. I said, if you publish a thing that links me to Russia, I will sue you into the ground for defamation. And I say also, I'll prove this allegation is not true.
Sure.
I'll prove the legitimate sourcing of our material. And luckily they don't publish. Because at the time, if the story comes out, a front page story or inside the story about in The Guardian about me having some connection to Russia, it's a disaster, right, of our little organization for this investigation I'm doing, but also the work I'm doing on state capture in South Africa. It's like literally at the time that stuff was happening, I've been working with the FBI and the DOJ on cases. And we were on the edge of finalizing a massive corruption case, which returns huge amounts of money to South Africa, a huge fine. It's $100 million goes back to South Africa on the basis of that work, right? And if it comes out that, and I've been working on asset forfeiture proceedings, I've been an expert witness in cases, that can really be used against us. The actors around the Guptas, the actors around Jacob Zuma would be this is a godsend for them.
Yeah.
Because they'd be able to be the guy who's been investigating us for 20 years is actually secretly an asset, is actually secretly an agent. And it would have destroyed so many of those investigations.
It's almost James Bondy. You've got so many people in so many different places that hate you that want to see this happen. And I imagine that's something they would do anyway, because that's what they do against people, is they use lawfare to sort of drag people out through court cases and
which has happened
lose money.
To us, right? And we were very lucky because what happened with us was that, we basically got a heads up. We were very, very lucky. It was basically in July, August 2024, after I've had that experience with The Guardian. And at that stage I realized something's up. I'm Labour Together are clearly unhappy with this reporting. This is a mad situation to develop. And then I get called by this journalist who I know quite well. Her name is Khadija Sharif. She's this absolutely phenomenal investigative journalist from South Africa. And she's been investigating all of these various quite unpleasant private security firms in the UK that get hired by multinational companies to basically deal to dust bust.
Right.
If there's a whistleblower who's come forward into this corruption, or if somebody's reporting on them negatively, they get hired and they deal with it. Right. And she calls me in July, I think it's July or August, around about then, or maybe September, I can't remember the exact day, and says, your name has come up in my investigations. And I'm what on earth are you talking about? How is my name coming up in your mad investigation? And she's no, your name has come up. You've been the target of one of these investigations. And I say to her, I don't believe you. How do I know that this is true? And then she mentions my partner's sister by name, who's not there's no way to connect me. The Khadija would have no idea that I'm connected to this person. I'm oh my word, how do you know this person? Because she's seen some of the investigative reports. And then she tells me, I say to her, who's the client? Who's been paying for this? And it's Labour Together. So we were very lucky because we knew something of what was happening. We knew that there was generally an investigation. I didn't know the details of it. I didn't know everything. I hadn't seen all the reports, but I knew that there was something. So we could take some degree of protection, proactive measures to protect ourselves. which really the primary thing was that basically we snuck the book into the public domain. Basically, we had to get the book out and do it in a way where we launched it so that these bad actors couldn't discredit me before it came out. Right. So basically, and the thing that we did without them even knowing is that the prologue to my book describes some of this work that APCO was doing.
Sure.
So in that we were like, you can't go after me like that. We know what you got. We know what you got in us. You know you've done this. But now, of course, it's a much bigger scandal because the whole series of details have come out. This guy, Josh Simons, who was a director of Labour Together, who got APCO appointed, was then elected as an MP, and then he became a cabinet minister. So he's now had to step down.
So what's happened with that, with the whole investigation into Labour Together? Because nothing's really come
at this point. I mean, it's sort of in the middle of nowhere. So what we have is loads of MPs are now saying, this is a real problem, that we've had this organisation that's had this like very, very deep and profound impact on our
You would
politics.
think that it would be like the first thing Nigel Farage would be talking about in the news, but I haven't really heard it talked about.
No, I mean, the Tories have been picking up on it. Actually, the people who are making the loudest noise about it are left-wing Labour MPs, right? They've been calling like for an independent inquiry into Labour Together.
Sure.
Because you have, this very profound story, actually, that between 2017 and 2020, there's like three phases to Labour Together. 2017 to 2020, they are using the secret money to like undermine their own party. And then the really important thing is that from 2023 onwards, Labour Together sort of is reactivated. It goes dormant for a while and it's reinvigorated. There's huge amounts of money that go into Labour Together, like vast amounts of money that go into Labour Together, which then is used to fund incoming Labour MPs. Over 100 Labour MPs have their election campaign funded by Labour Together, which effectively means that Labour Together is passing on big donations from about 10 donors, right? At the same time, Morgan McSweeney, who's been part of Labour Together, takes on this position of huge power in the Labour Party, and he's effectively hand-picking Labour MPs.
Yeah.
Alongside, and now it turns out we've just discovered, alongside Peter Mandelson, who's helping him in this process.
Everybody's favourite.
Everyone's favourite. So you have the situation where Peter Mandelson and Morgan McSweeney is choosing who can and can't be an MP in the Labour Party. At the same time, Labour Together is funding all these MPs. At the same time, right, that Labour Together is hiring this firm APCO to go after journalists who are reporting on them accurately, right? So it's a pretty ugly story, actually.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a pretty mad, crazy story to have this organisation that's been involved in two different time periods in like some pretty serious, like ethically dubious stuff.
Yeah, it does feel like some sort of American film from the 80s about horrible stuff that's going on. And you do sort of talk about it in the book as well, that £700,000 doesn't sound like much when everyone always hears about like tens of millions for American donations from lobbyists. But here it's quite a big deal.
I mean, here it's a huge deal because actually donations are quite strictly controlled, right? And like the amount that you can spend in an election campaign is very strictly controlled. So, in a general election campaign, I think the spending limits for a political party are like around 18 to 20 million pounds, right?
Sure.
Which is like really not that much money at all. In the context of British politics, the amount of money that goes through Labour Together is huge. So to give you a good example, in 2023, 2024, the National in Scotland did an analysis of all the money goes through Labour Together. So close to like £1.5, £2 million.
Right.
That is 60% of all of the money that's going to regulate the political entities that are not political parties. 60% of all political funding for regulated entities is going to Labour Together to basically fund 100 MPs. Now that's like, we have a bit of a problem because you have this political project that's used like misdirection, dishonesty, unlawfulness to take power, which is transform, like really at like a very deep and fundamental transform the Labour Party. Then you have Labour Together, which is funding these people. And now you have a parliament where like 200 of its members have been handpicked by Morgan McSweeney and Peter Mandelson, or certainly with Peter Mandelson's input. And then these people are voting on our fundamental rights.
Yeah.
Right. And that's a real problem. Suddenly we're going to have, there's been the possibility of jury trials being scrapped for like cases under 3 years, like a really fundamental dyed-in-the-wool right.
The news yesterday that apparently now, what is it? If you get sentenced to a year, you automatically have to suspend that sentence. So it's a thing where if you can get 18 months, you can technically, you could argue based on good conduct or admitting to guilt that an 18-month sentence gets dropped down to a year, and then you automatically have to suspend anything less than a year because the prisons are too full.
Yeah, right. Which is like a mad situation to be in where basically the other problem that we have with this political project is that they're not a huge amount different to the Tories in the way they're like running the state.
Yeah.
So they're refusing to do the things that we need to do to like fund our basic social services. Right? They're not raising the money from the places where it's available to, from to like actually fund our prisons properly.
Yeah.
To they've tried to cut welfare repeatedly. They try to cut disability benefit repeatedly, which is really ugly stuff. Right?
There's all the stuff happening with Israel. Could you speak to a little bit to
Sure.
the biggest donors to Labour Together?
Sure.
Because there was Israeli interests there, and I think that speaks to a little bit of what we're seeing now.
Yeah, I mean, it is a problem that you basically have, and it's a complicated discussion, but basically one of the biggest funders of Labour Together for a long time, one of the biggest donors is this guy called Trevor Chin. So Trevor Chin, who is... for a long time, he's on the executive committee of what's called the Jewish Leadership Council. Also involved in this thing called BICOM, which is like an Israel lobby group. And he funds Labour Together from 2017 onwards, right?
Sure.
And he actually sits on the board of Labour Together for a long period of time. While Morgan McSweeney is doing the stuff around Stop Funding Fake News and also secretly not declaring the money. Some of the money he's not declaring is Trevor Chin's money.
Right.
And now Trevor Chin is literally last year was given what's called the Presidential Medal of Honor by Israel, by Isaac Herzog, who was cited by the International Court of Justice as making plausibly genocidal statements in Gaza. Right? We now know, because Declassified's done a story about the extent to which various communal organizations were like lobbying for him to get this award. And then there's been all these stories that have come out of old statements he made, where he literally said, I think it was in 2013, saying something along the lines of, I've dedicated my life to Israel. Right now, he has very clear views on Israel. He has very clear views on what constitutes like what he wants to see happen in relation to Israel. And he is a major donor to Labour Together, and he's been a major player in it. And quite a lot of the figures who are associated with Labour Together are also members of the thing called Labour Friends of Israel. And Labour Friends of Israel, like the Conservative Friends of Israel, is a very problematic organisation from a governance perspective, because we have no idea who's funding it.
Yeah.
It's this mad situation where you have Labour MPs who are being sent to Israel on these paid-for trips. And same thing with Conservative MPs as well, being sent to Israel effectively on like these trips that convince them of like the correctness of the Israeli position in relation to Gaza. Nobody knows who's funding that. I mean, that is like a real problem for like our democracy.
Is there any way to track
Nobody
the
knows.
MPs that take a visit?
So we know who takes a visit because they have to declare it in their registered members' interest. We have no idea who's paying for it. No idea who's paying for it. Right? It's like a deep fundamental failure of transparency. And Labour Friends of Israel, which is very influential in this particular cabinet, like a lot of the cabinet members who are now in Starmer's cabinet have either spoken at LFI events or are members of LFI.
Sure.
And LFI takes a very specific approach to Israel, which is basically they'll rhetorically say, we support a two-state solution. We want to see peace between Palestine and Israel, but effectively stop any meaningful steps towards achieving that beyond asking Israel nicely.
Sure.
Like anything like BDS, for example, which is actually something that's been called for by Palestinian civil society organizations as an effective, non-violent way of putting pressure on Israel to change, is rendered unacceptable. The act of being anti-Zionist is considered to be totally unacceptable. So LFI literally put out like a Twitter thread it's February 2024, saying that there's no room for anti-Zionism in the Labour tradition, right? Which is very problematic because if you look at, when I saw that tweet, I contacted this organization called the Institute for Jewish Public Policy Research. And I said, well, they do these surveys of the Jewish community. And I said, well, how many Jewish people in the UK are anti-Zionist? And they said 10% of all Jewish people in the UK are anti-Zionist, which means there's 10% of Jewish people want to see Israel destroyed and replaced with something else, but they don't believe in like a Jewish majority state of Israel. And then a further 20-30% of the Jewish population in the UK are what is described as non-Zionist. So like they don't necessarily want to see Israel destroyed, but they don't support its existence necessarily. They don't like the government. And you basically have an organization that has lots of influence saying that if you are anti-Zionist, you can no longer be part of the Labour Party, which means that 10% of Jewish people in Britain are not welcome in the Labour Party. That's a mad situation to be in, right?
And then you've got momentum, so you're bringing people up in that sort of school of thought as well, anti-Zionist.
Well, I'm not sure momentum wouldn't necessarily be... So momentum's the more left-wing. Yeah, so they would be... I think they'd be agnostic on anti-Zionism. They don't think that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism.
Wasn't it the thing where Labour Friends of Israel is sort of quite tied in with momentum?
No, not really.
Okay.
Labour Friends of Israel tends to be closer to... So momentum was like the pro-Corbyn wing of the party.
Okay.
And they were... generally speaking, they take a slightly more robust line on Israel than other places. Labour Friends of Israel is more connected to generally speaking, to the right wing of the Labour Party.
Right. Yeah, that was an interesting... I think the main thing that stands out in your book is the factionalism between the party itself, because there's these ideas that, Labour's the left, Tories are the right, and that's... the two will never meet, but there's this whole underworking and dividing and selecting of politicians, which is, I think it's the best explanation. Your book is the best explanation for what we're seeing now with Keir Starmer.
That's very kind.
Genuinely, it's the only thing that makes sense.
Yeah.
Because he made all these promises, sort of reneged on a bunch of them. There's the whole thing with the trans movement where he was like, trans women are women, and then the biological argument came out and was put into law, and he's like, well, and he doesn't really answer the question anymore.
Yeah. I mean, he is a, he is a person who pushes a, he is I think one of the most dishonest politicians that Britain's ever experienced. And the thing that's interesting about him, and I think what the book does and explains about this political project, is that it explains that dishonesty and misdirection is at the heart of their political methodology. It's what they do, it's how they function. Because they have a very clear-eyed sense in the Labour Party between 2017 and 2020. When Keir Starmer runs for leader in 2020, it's very clear to everybody who's involved in his leadership campaign that if he says, I'm actually going to be a very right-wing leader, and I don't believe in party unity, and I don't believe in net zero being very important, that he's never going to be elected the leader of the Labour Party. And the same thing happens again in 2024 during the general election, where Labour suddenly, from Keir Starmer pretending to be a socialist inheritor of the Corbynite tradition, who's like an eco-socialist in 2020, he presents himself as basically indistinguishable on key aspects of policy from Rishi Sunak, from the Tory party, right? And the point is that general election is also effectively an extremely dishonest campaign, where they're not telling people ahead of time how they're actually going to govern, because they know if they tell people how they're actually going to govern, people won't vote for them.
Yeah.
Right. And this is what's happened, is that actually they've been voted for. They didn't win a huge majority of, they won a huge majority of seats on a very small fraction of the vote. They only got 35% of the popular vote, but 2/3 of the MPs because of the first past the post system. And that means that this is a political project that as soon as the public sees what it actually is, people are horrified by it.
Yeah.
They're furious. They feel really deeply, fundamentally betrayed about what they thought they were going to get, what they thought they were voting for, and what they've actually gotten, which is very different from what they expected.
Yeah.
At a very basic level, one of the things that the Labour Party said was, we are not as sleazy as the Tories. We're not going to be involved in dodgy stuff. There's not going to be corruption around us. We're not going to take freebies. We're not going to be co-opted.
Yeah, I saw your article this morning where after Keir Starmer it was found out that he was taking pajamas and glasses for thousands of pounds, he continued to go to football
matches.
VIB.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
I mean, and if you actually still, that sort of scandal has faded from the public imagination. But you go look at Labour Party MPs' disclosures now, they're still taking huge numbers of freebies, which is really problematic around industries they are regulating. You can't do that from an anti-government government.
I read what was his name, Tom. I can't remember the biography on Keir Starmer.
Tom Holden,
yeah. Read his biography, and I was like, oh, actually, maybe he's not so bad, and he's done a bunch of things for DHS in the past, and seems like quite a good guy and quite a working class guy. I think was the main selling point of the book.
Right.
And then he comes out and starts taking all these glasses and pajamas and things. And
I think it's
what's the difference between him and the Tories? It doesn't really feel.
And that's the problem. We had a real problem in 2023, 2024 that people were trying to. I was trying to tell journalists, you have to report on these freebie stuff because it's not hard to find. It's in his public disclosures and nobody's reporting it. I even did a video for this thing called Double Down News being people have to talk about these freebies. You have to know about it. And nobody reported on it before the election. And then it comes out after the election. And that's really damaging.
Yeah.
Because you have these people who have been like, I'm electing this guy who seems like he's up straight. He's like, it's upright. He's not already being co-opted by these people. And then it turns out he's been taking donors from taking freebies from millionaires and billionaires and from gambling companies and from sports companies, from the Premier League, all things that he is supposed to be regulating. That's a real problem. And then, of course, the thing that's really messed them up is Mandelson. Because Mandelson is a figure that nobody wants in politics. Like, if you ask ordinary people on the street, do you want Peter Mandelson to be involved in our politics? They're like, hell no.
I've read a little bit about that. So they didn't investigate him as much as they otherwise should have, and
I mean, basically, Parliament. The way that played out, Morgan McSweeney is very close to Peter Mandelson.
Okay,
right. They go back a long time, at least from 2017 onwards. Peter Mandelson does seem to be working very closely with Morgan McSweeney from 2020 in particular, after Keir Starmer wins the Labour leadership. They have a very close working relationship. And it's effectively Morgan McSweeney who pushes for Peter Mandelson's appointment, which is interesting because at the time in the US, the White House was saying, we don't want Peter Mandelson. Actually, they quite liked this woman called Karen Pierce, who was the ambassador beforehand, saying, we work with her well, we've got a good relationship, don't change the ambassador. Not least because Mandelson had actually said stuff in the past about Trump they didn't like. He said comments in 2018, 2019 that they didn't like. And they were saying don't appoint him. But it's basically pushed through. And now what we've seen is this disclosure is that the level of due diligence they did on him was pathetic. Like genuinely pathetic. Like literally a 3-page document setting out some issues. But even that 3-page document is like, you read the document, you're like, why are you appointing this guy? Because even that 3-page document is saying, first of all, he owns a massive lobbying firm. Yeah. This is going to be a problem. Second of all, he's close to Jeffrey Epstein. He was close to Jeffrey Epstein for a long time. He was like staying in Jeffrey Epstein's apartment, apparently, while Jeffrey Epstein was in jail for soliciting prostitution from minors, right? Do not appoint this guy. And yet it happens anyway, and they still appoint him. And there's all sorts of issues around like what level of security clearance he got given at what time before he was even vetted. What becomes very clear is that there is like a decision to appoint this guy like come hell or high water, right? And of course, then more of the Epstein files come out.
Yeah.
And then we really see like the closeness of the relationship between Jeffrey Epstein and Peter Mandelson for a long time. Yeah. And it's really problematic stuff. It's like, there's like real issues around he was in government and he was telling Jeffrey Epstein like sensitive things. It's like, it's really, really, really ugly. But entirely predictable.
Yeah.
Right? Like there's no way he should have been appointed. Absolutely no way. And I think it's sort of actually a reflection of how corrupted and corrupting this political project is in this moment where they can choose the most important diplomatic figure for the UK. Like, understood widely to be the most influential ambassador you're going to appoint. They choose Peter goddamn Mandelson, who everybody could tell you at the time this is going to be a disaster, and they push for it. And it's sort of poetic justice in a sense. This is the thing that starts unraveling them.
It does sort of feel like it feels like not enough people know about this story, and it's sort of scary because it feels like the genie's out of the bottle now. They won, they're in, they won, and it doesn't. I don't see why other political parties wouldn't use the same playbook.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's concerning is this is the problem that you have with South Africa, right? This is the thing that you learn is when people win and achieve power through nefarious means, they don't stop being nefarious when they get into power. Right? They're not like, I broke the law and I got away with it, and I'm just gonna now be like clean as a whistle.
And if anything, you're more answerable to the people that got you in the first place.
So there is a sense of like, it's a real problem when you have people who've like really misconducted themselves in the way that somebody like Morgan McSweeney has, or some people around Labour Together, like somebody like Steve Reid, for example, who I think is very problematic, and I've written about quite a lot. When they get into power, it creates these like very perverse situations where suddenly you have the institutions of state which need to function properly, and they need to look into them, and it doesn't work. So a good example is around this new stuff that came out about APCO and Labour Together and investigation, and in response to it, Keir Starmer appoints what's called an independent ethics advisor to investigate this guy Josh Simons, who's an MP. And I've been trying to give evidence to this investigation. I never get a response, right? And this guy, Josh Simons, is effectively cleared of wrongdoing.
Right.
And I'm saying, but this, you didn't have all the evidence. You didn't look at this material, right? Like, it's very problematic for governance when you have these sorts of people in power. And I worry about the extent to which, like, this stuff really creates, like, deep levels of distrust in our society around our politicians. Because they, when they behave like this, they deserve to be distrusted.
Yeah.
And that has really malignant outcomes. Like, on one hand, it has that people just don't get involved in politics at all, which is obviously a problem, because if good people aren't involved in politics, bad people will be involved in politics, right? And the second thing is, I think it's feeding. I'm very concerned about, I don't know what your politics are, but I'm very concerned about, like, the rise of the far right in the UK.
I think most people are, certainly London.
Yeah. And, like, there's a real concern that this is opening the door for, like, a Farage sort of politics.
Yeah.
Because people are seeing, like, oh, the Labour Party is no different to the Tories. Our life isn't getting better. These people lie all the time. Let's go with somebody different, right? And I think that if there's I think it'll be a very scary thing if we have a right-wing government like that, like a far-right government.
There is a lot to be said for, even if you don't like everything a politician says, at least they wear their heart on their sleeve. Nigel Farage says what he thinks. You might not like it, but at least you can trust him to enact the policies that he says he's going to.
Yeah, I think there's also some issues around, like, I think people aren't paying enough attention to reforms funding and stuff like that. I think that's very interesting. People need to be understanding actually who's funding this thing. But I can understand people being pissed off. I can understand people being like, our politicians lie to us repeatedly.
Yeah.
Like, the one thing that Farage doesn't beat around the bush about what he believes, right? And I don't agree. I pretty much disagree with everything he says, but I also get the sense that he doesn't say that much he doesn't believe.
Yeah.
Right. Now, that is very different to what people have experienced in this country for 20 or 30 years, right? What I'm hoping is that on the left, there's a lesson to be learned there, that you actually have, like, the emergence of, like, a genuine, authentic, non-triangulating politician who can speak truthfully. I think people respond well to truth talking, right? Let's just see whether somebody emerges. I quite like Zach Balansky personally. I think he's quite good.
I hope the lessons are to be learned if, say, the Greens are reform. I don't want them to get in, but if they get in, lessons to be learned on behalf of Labour and the Tories, that if you keep up this sort of stuff, no one's going to trust you, and that we're going to... It feels like politics is changing. It's sort of falling apart, and there's this idea that, like, the party believes in one thing, but that's not really the case. And...
Yeah, I mean, I call this, the book is called, The Fraud, Keir Starmer, Morgan Stanley, in the Crisis of British Democracy. And the crisis of British democracy is precisely this, is that you've basically had a political project that's been running for close to a decade, which now controls the state, which is deeply dishonest, is deeply unethical, has skirted the edge of the law on more than one occasion, right? Has behaved in very problematic ways. And it's creating this massive vacuum at the heart of our politics, where what I worry about is, in addition to the fact that it's creating distrust, we're going to have a Labour government that doesn't do anything meaningful. That's going to have another 5 wasted years. I've already seen in South Africa what it's like when you have a government that's not functioning properly, where you waste another 5 or 10 years. And what we've had, really since the financial crisis in 2008, we've had wasted decades. People's lives have gotten worse. People's living standards have collapsed. Now we have the war in Iran. It's like there is the possibility of, like, serious economic hardship, right? Like, people's lives are getting worse. Even, like, from a personal experience, I moved here in 2009, and I've noticed at a very personal level how the services that I accessed in 2009 are not the same services I access now. So the NHS is not nearly what it was when I first came here. I was like, amazed by the NHS when I first came here. Now, despite, like, all the hard work of the doctors who, like, work themselves to the bone, it's just not funded correctly, right?
Well, you've got the big, was it £240 million contract with Palantir to come in and sort of take over the NHS, and then they said they were basically going to help with the admin systems, but then there were leaked emails saying they were basically going to buy out loads of smaller practices and essentially take it over and turn it into an American-style system.
Yeah, I mean, the idea that Palantir is the sharp edge of, like, a real terrifying wave of, like, sort of stealth privatization of the NHS, which has been going on for a long time. And it's like, it's hollowing out the service. It really is. And, like, it creates these really perverse incentives for the service not to work properly.
Yeah.
Like, if people are pursuing medical care for profit, or just at the very basic level, like it adds the costs to everyone. If the NHS is paying for people's profit, it means that we're paying 10 or 15 or 20%. And actually, the thing that's been fascinating is when people have investigated private contracts and they've actually looked at like the levels of profit, you have like serious price gouging going on, like services that are being charged double what they should be charged by private suppliers to the NHS. It's a real problem, right? And Palantir getting involved is madness to me. I mean, it's utterly, like, it's total madness, because they're an explicitly, like, dystopian
surveillance state, Orwellian, bad for all sorts of reasons.
Yeah, exactly.
There's no benefits.
There's no benefits to having Palantir having access to our patient data. That's just not a good thing.
Yeah.
And that's the thing that drives people and says that nobody outside of people in power think it's a good thing. Most people are like, this is a disaster, please don't do this. And it's a real problem when we can't get that expressed, get that carried through to our political leadership, to our elites, to say, we draw the line here, we don't want this anymore. And again, it creates a sense of like frustration and anger that can go to like really malignant places, really ugly places.
Have you seen anything in terms of, it feels like your party with Jeremy Corbyn and can't remember
Zara
Sultana. It feels like it started off really exciting. It was a couple of months ago they sort of announced it. They announced the name and everyone's like, oh, Jeremy Corbyn's back.
Yeah.
Have you seen anything to the effect that Labour Together or the people involved are discrediting them in the same way? I imagine they are.
I think there was probably a plan to do so. I think actually the target has changed. I think not Labour Together, but the Labour Party in general has moved to just trying to discredit Zach Polanski and the Greens. And Steve Reid, again, who was part of Labour Together, seems to be leading that charge in quite ugly ways, again, by accusing the Green Party of being anti-Semitic, even though Zach Polanski is himself Jewish, right? Like really, 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 really ugly stuff. Again, the same playbook. I think it's not going to work in the same way this time around. I think it's very problematic to repeatedly say that the Jewish leader of a political party is overseeing an anti-Semitic party. That's just not going to... I think most people find that quite offensive as an allegation.
Yeah.
And I think that your party had this moment of like real momentum, and I'm afraid it looks to me like it's dissipated.
I haven't heard anything about them. I had to sort of go deep digging yesterday just to find anything that they talked about, because now it's Greens versus Reform is all you hear, or Restore is now coming into the light.
I mean, so the Greens, when Zach Polanski was elected leader, I mean, he's very effective at, when he joined when he ran for leader of the Green Party, their membership was like 60, 70,000. It's now like 220,000 in less than a year of him becoming leader, which is incredible, right? Like incredible result. And basically, the Labour Party has vacated for all sorts of reasons, primarily because it's being guided by this Labour Together Morgan McSweeney project, which is very right wing. They've completely abandoned like core voters who voted for them for a long time. They just sort of took them for granted.
Was there any mass movement of Labour MPs leaving to other
Not Labour
parties?
MPs, but Labour members. That's been quite interesting, right? So the Labour Party membership when Keir Starmer took over was 520,000 people, members of the Labour Party paying, I think it's £3 a month, right? And I just did a story with the Times about 2 months ago where I was given in the Labour Party figures, the membership is now 260,000, right? I suspect that actually over the next year or so, the longer the Keir Starmer stays, he's so deeply unpopular, they're going to fall and the Green Party is going to overtake them. And huge numbers of people who were Labour Party members, ordinary people, have now defected to the Greens. So, I did an event last night where I was up in Leicester speaking to like a Leicester Green Party. And I always say, like, anybody who wants to hear from me, like, I'm happy to go speak. So I speak to Labour Party events, I speak to Green Party events.
Sure.
And the thing that's interesting about the Green Party event last night, I'd say there were 80 people there. Half of them were ex-Labour members.
Right.
Like, some of them very actively involved. Some of them are like ex-Labour Party councillors, like involved in the Labour Party in a very fundamental way. There are loads of people who felt like the Labour Party's betrayed them and they've found like a new home in the Greens. And I think that's going to happen more widely politically. Like, I think places like London, places like Bristol, places like Brighton, there is a sense that the Labour Party has like abandoned its core vote. Like its core multi-ethnic working class vote. Yeah.
Do you get the sense that that's because people know about your reporting and sort of what they did, or they just generally feel that they've been let down by Keir Starmer? I know he's the most unpopular prime minister ever.
Polling began. I mean, it's him and Liz Truss, basically.
Right. Okay.
Like,
And she was only there for a day.
Yeah, she was like there for less the time than it took for like a lettuce to decay.
I cannot stand the videos of Liz Truss online. She's got a YouTube channel now, and she goes on and speaks to all these. She's now popular in America because they don't realize how. From what I've seen, she speaks to American news stations and American journalists. Just have a look on YouTube because she goes on and you get all these things of British Prime Minister, whatever, and they sort of use her as an important guest. And I'm like, you have no idea how terrible she was,
and also how like most people think she's absolutely mad. Like he is like a joke, basically.
Oh yeah. Just the video of her talking about the pork markets and the apples, and that's all you got to watch.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's a combination. I don't want to like oversell the importance of my book. I mean, I think it's had some impact. Like, obviously, some people have had to resign as a result of my reporting. From in Number 10, there was a director of strategy there who, I revealed some text about him, which were not, he said some pretty unpleasant things, and he was forced to resign. I definitely think that what's happened over time is almost subtly the argument behind the book is filtered through into sort of broader media consciousness. There is this like generalized sense of like something is deeply wrong with this political project that we didn't expect it. It doesn't look or behave like we expect a Labour government to behave, and why is this, right? But I think fundamentally, like it's goose was cooked within a month or two of them taking power when they cut the winter food allowance, because that sent a message to people. For people who don't know, that's like a universal allowance that's given to elderly people to help them heat their homes. Basically.
Yeah, it was like 2 years ago they cut that. Yeah,
and even at the time, like all of the like a lot of old age and elderly charities were saying like you're going to send elderly people into like serious poverty. Serious poverty.
I remember reading a story of one woman who I think it was in the BBC, a woman who just rode the bus all day because she couldn't afford her heating. She's like, it's cheaper to pay the $175 for the bus and literally ride it all day and then go home. Yeah.
I mean, it's mad stuff. You have people who are like, there were hundreds of thousands of people they predicted would fall into poverty as a result of that. And like the idea that a Labour Party would come in and one of its first things to do, like they were almost proud of it.
Yeah.
They were like, they presented it as like, look, we can be as tough as the Tories. Look, we are taking our commitment to fiscal discipline seriously. And like, that was the end of them. But I also just think, generally speaking, people have watched this government and it's been a very unimpressive performance, right? Like, it's been like endless, like it feels like nearly endless scandal, especially around the Peter Mandelson stuff. There's been like real grassroots anger, like genuine fury at the way in which the Labour Party and this Labour government has handled Israel, for example, and the situation in Gaza. You can't have a situation where in the midst of, the horrors of Gaza, you have senior figures from Israel coming to visit and shake Keir Starmer's hand. Like the famous photo of like Keir Starmer meeting Isaac Herzog. Like, that has really appalled people more widely than I think people in Westminster understand. Like, I don't think people in Westminster understand the extent to which Gaza has been fundamental in ordinary people's understanding of politics here. Because for a lot of people, this was the first time, I know people personally who are not politically super engaged, but for the first time when this stuff happened and guys started seeing these images of like children, parents dying, innocent civilians dying, medical workers dying, like in the most like grotesque and gruesome,
it does feel like there's a big disconnect between Westminster. And you talk to anyone in the street and they know what's going on in Gaza and they don't really like it, and they might not want the destruction of Israel, but they're like, just stop it happening. And it does feel like every single Labour MP, for the most part that I've seen, doesn't agree with that idea.
Well, they will generally refuse to criticize Israel in any sort of meaningful way. I won't do anything to stop it, because clearly what we should be doing right now is doing an arms embargo in Israel. Like, it's mad for us to be sending weapons components to Israel.
It was defensive. The argument was it was defensive technologies, and
they've used every.
It was planes and drones.
Well, they gave components for the F-35 jets, right? Those F-35 jets are filled.
They're defensive planes.
They're defensive planes that just happened to drop 2,000-pound JDAM bombs on civilian populations in Gaza, and now are going to be threatening to drop 2,000 JDAM bombs on civilian populations in Iran.
Yeah,
right. Like, it's plain that I think actually, if you look at underlying polling in the UK, most people in the UK, they may not be anti-Zionist, but they're like, we should have an arms embargo on Israel. That we should be restraining Israel from undertaking its, what it's been doing in Iran and what it's been doing in Gaza. That these are not acceptable things for us to be involved in. And, for a lot of people, this has been the first time in their lives where they have felt so disconnected, both from the media, but also from their politicians. Because I think for a lot of people, it's a very strange experience when you can see on your phone what's happening in Gaza, and then you're listening to the BBC or you're listening to the Guardian and you're listening to other papers, and you're like, but this doesn't connect, right? And in a very deep and fundamental way, this is totally, I think, cut off a big part of a generally left-leaning, but not entirely left-leaning, voting population from like establishment political parties. Like I think this has really deeply severed the connection between ordinary people and the Labour Party in a fundamental way. And I think it's potentially existential for the party. Like I think we have elections coming up in May. All the polling suggests that the Labour Party is going to be like annihilated at a councillor level. We've had 2 big by-elections, Caerphilly in Wales. It's a seat that the Labour Party's held for 100 years that they lost to Plaid Cymru. And then up in Manchester and Gorton, another seat that should be like bread and butter Labour. It's been in the Labour Party forever. Be lost to the Greens, right? Like it just feels like the Labour Party, because of this political project I'm describing, which has used dishonesty, but it's also moved the party, basically made it like a continuity Tory party.
Yeah.
It's just so appalled people.
That's what you want from things like your reporting. You want people to shift and then make the Labour Party realise the error of its ways, as opposed to political disinterest, which I think is a big part of this as well. People go, oh, what's the point? Nothing changes. They just do the same thing that people did before. It doesn't really matter who's in power.
I want accountability. That's like my primary aim for reporting is always accountability. And accountability can have multiple different things. Like I think there should be accountability for certain people I write about. I think they should be investigated by regulators or law enforcement agencies. In South Africa, I want bad people who pay bribes to go to jail, right? There's also a different level of accountability, which is just like the public knows enough about their politicians that they can hold them to account personally.
Sure.
As in, I know what you've done. I'm going to ask you questions about it. If you don't have satisfactory answers, I'm not going to be supporting you. And if the book does anything like that and makes our politicians more accountable, I'm happy.
If they were to become more accountable, do you think this whole idea of anti-Semitism being mixed in with anti-Zionism will finally stop? I feel like it's a problem in America, but I feel like it's a really big problem here, specifically from that Labour election in 2017, 2018. I feel like it's always been a really big problem here.
It is, this conflation of anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. I think it's a real issue. I feel like the terrain has shifted anyway. Again, I think Gaza is this like really fundamental thing, because there's a lot of people who understand, who've watched the horrors play out and be like, how is it that we are, the thing that we're most concerned about is moderating speech in response to horrors rather than the horrors themselves.
Sure.
Right? Like I think that stuff doesn't hold nearly as much weight. I mean, what we're seeing, I think, from the Labour Party is they are still trying to carry this on. So, for example, where Streeting is in the NHS service trying to introduce what's called the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, which which is it's a complicated discussion, but one of the effects of it, one of the critiques of it, is that it constrains speech on Israel and what people can say about Israel. And so, I think this Labour government is going to push ahead with it. I think there's going to be like a level of like grassroots resistance to it, that people don't want to accept that. The people are going to be like, it's not appropriate for us not to be able to criticize Israel. And it's not appropriate for us to say to Jewish people that you can't be anti-Zionist.
Yeah.
Like it's not okay for that to be the case. And I do think it's interesting the extent to which there was an article that came out in Huffington Post last year, briefed by an unnamed member of cabinet about how they're going to up the attacks on the Greens from the Labour Party. And one of the vectors of attack is going to be anti-Semitism. And it really feels like that's not working in the same way. I think there's like this real distaste at this idea that you would almost preemptively, or like in a premeditated way, decide this is the issue we're going to attack like a formation on. And I don't think it's going to work in the same way. And this is like, it's a key aspect of our society, that this is an issue that's going to be debated and it's going to be fought over. People are going to have extremely strong opinions on it. I generally think that within society at large, there is an acceptance now that Israel is worthy of criticism. At least this government of Israel is worthy of criticism because of the way they've conducted themselves in Gaza, because of the way they repeatedly conduct themselves in the West Bank, because of the way they've conducted themselves in Iran. Like, I think there is this generalized acceptance that we need to be able to talk about this freely and openly. And I think it's also, I think from a left-wing perspective, I think that we should always do it in a respectful way. We should always do it in a way that's humane and respects people's like very intense feelings around this. But we shouldn't shy away from being open and honest about what we see Israel's conduct achieving in places like Gaza.
I think just the marches, which I've not seen that much reporting on, but just protests against what Israel is doing within Israel. Against Netanyahu, and there's all the potential corruption charges about him.
And that's the mad thing with him is that again, it's a good example of what happens when you have a corrupt leader who's in power. Because one of the problems with Israel, with Netanyahu, who really is a very extreme figure, like he is extremely. I mean, his views on Gazans and Palestinians is really pretty despicable. But he's also got this long-standing corruption trial hanging over his head around arms deals, right? So it goes back to some of the themes of the work that we've been doing before, but. You have a situation where if there is no war, he goes on trial. Every time he goes on trial, there's a new emergency situation that happens, and then he can't go on trial anymore. It's utterly perverse to have a situation where this guy is staying out of jail by causing instability around the world. It's mad, crazy stuff.
Yeah. To sort of round it off and make it a little bit more positive, are you going to have to leave Britain anytime soon? Gonna have to move away, like moving away from South Africa? No. There's no danger or worry on your part of what might happen with this investigation into you and your family.
No, I think we were lucky that we got on top of it. We were extremely lucky that we were told ahead of time, so we could sort of take protective measures around it.
Sure.
And I think it's been. It's been a big relief to see the media pick up on it as well and reporting it, because it does make a big difference, like in terms of protection. The most, because I always work on these long form investigations. I don't always write for the newspapers. I always basically work on big, lengthy investigations on books, and I publish them, and it's like a big thing.
Sure.
Usually because I'm trying to push for like some degree of accountability, and you're always in the most dangerous position before you publish. Because that's when people who you're investigating are aware of what you're doing, but people don't know the public doesn't know what I'm doing. And the fact that now the book is out, the fact that like the Guardian, the BBC, and the Sunday Times have all reported on this investigation, I think has killed that as a line of inquiry. Thank God. And you know what? Fuck it. Like I'm not going anywhere. I have a family here. I've got daughters born here. My partner's British, and I'm invested in making this country better in the long term as a journalist, as an investigator, and just as like a person. So I'm not going anywhere.
Great. You're not going to get scared out of journalism and become a DJ again anytime soon?
No, I think my partner Jess would really hate that. I just started ending DJing by the time we started dating.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and I remember her came to I played a gig up in Johannesburg, and I was like, this is just not her vibe. This is not her vibe.
Right.
Yeah.
I hope more people find out about your work, because it's boggling, the amount of information, the amount of names and everything. Hope you do an audiobook as well.
We will do an audiobook. It's going to happen.
All right.
Yeah,
you said it here on camera.
You can read it. That'd be great.
Great. Amazing. Thank you so much.
Cool. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Cheers.
Cheers.